Welcome all. My name is John Bird, and I am representing the Office of Strategic Engagement here at JSOU. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. If you have any questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.us as indicated on the slide.
Hey, good morning. I am Dave Oakley, the chair of the Department of Strategic Intelligence and Emerging Technology at JSOU. And I'm the fortunate individual who gets to interview a great guest today, Mr. Doug London, a 34-year veteran of the CIA and the author of an excellent recent book called The Recruiter, Spying and the Lost Art of American Intelligence. Welcome, Doug.
Thanks. Great to be here, Dave.
You know, I really found your book fascinating. To me, it is something I think could be of interest to multiple audiences. You know, I think for the general audience, it's engaging reader. You show a little bit behind the curtain of an agency that is known of. The acronym is very well known, but I think very little understood out of the organization itself. For the national security practitioner, I think the thing that really resonated with your book, was that, you know, although you were critical of the organization and raised some very important issues, you were also reflective and really, you know, you kind of look back at yourself and some decision you make. And a lot of times you don't see that in these type of books, right? It's the author is always kind of the hero and they had all the brilliant ideas, but you really kind of challenge yourself. And I appreciate that about the book. You know, and also from the critiques, even of the organization, you could tell it came not out of a place of bitterness, but out of a place of love for the agency that you had dedicated so much of your life and a desire to improve it. You know, I also think there's a little bit of the palace intrigue in the book that you know, both professionals and the lay audience will enjoy reading. And then finally, you know, I'd like to thank you because I'm a big fan of spy movies and comedies. And I had never heard of Hopscotch with Walter Matthau, and so I raced out and I watched that, and it's an excellent movie. And I think you're right about the Walter Matthau character. You know, to me, I was going over your bio, and you have some very rich experience. And looking over the 34 years of your career, to me, you really, you know, you came in 1984. You know, towards the end of not only towards the end of the Cold War, but a year after the Beirut barracks bombing, year after the Grenada invasion, right before the year of the spy, where like the Walker spy ring and others were caught. You lived through those latter years. You hit the transition point between the Cold War and the shift to the 1990s and what was thought of back then as the peace dividend, which we found out was really not the case. You saw the CIA during that time reduced, and then you lived through 9/11, really kind of shaped most of your career in that post 9/11 global war and terrorism fight. You know, that timeline, you know, is just, you really got to see many years of the CIA and its ups and downs. And I was hoping you could speak a little bit about those transition points, and particularly the post 9/11 and the global war on terrorism and how that affected the CIA.
Thanks, Dave. Again, it's really a delight to be here. I've had the really good fortune to work at times very closely with the SOF community, which has always embraced me and made me feel included. I still serve sometimes as an advisor on some exercises, and I do some teaching for some of SOF's IC elements. So it's great to have this audience, and I'm very thankful for everybody who's participating. The book, I appreciate how you framed it. I loved my career. I absolutely did, and I hope that comes across. Some people have suggested, and I totally agree, it's a love letter about espionage with an expression of concern about maybe where the CIA has been going post 9/11, finding itself now at what I believe at a crossroads. And crossroads isn't a negative in and of itself. Crossroads means opportunity, and being a spy, and I think your community will agree, we see opportunity in chaos. We see opportunity in challenges. We tend to be the types of people who want to make lemonade out of lemons. So when I wrote the book, I tried to frame it in a way that cast the agency, as I believe, as such a critical component for US national security, and tried to shine light on the realities of human intelligence operations to give it a more human character. And I'm not suggesting that, oh, this is about just simply dispelling the myths, because there's certainly risks. People get hurt, people die in the business. But to put a real human face on it, because when you say human intelligence, that's really what it is. It's about human beings and relationships. And I tried to use those anecdotes that I could, those that I felt were appropriate, that I could sterilize enough in a way that, even stripping away some of the details so that we wouldn't compromise sources or methods or get anyone hurt or in trouble, left the reader with a real appreciation for what was at stake and what were those, people to people dynamics. Using those anecdotes to then reflect, as you framed well, on transition points that I saw, good ones, bad ones, and where the agency, I believe, had changed its culture 9/11. And that's fundamentally the concern I express in the book about the post 9/11 days. And I served more or less equally on both sides of 9/11, 17 plus years on either side. I did come in at a consequential time. I had friends who died in the Marine Corps bombing, the barracks bombing in Beirut, because I was a communicator in the Marine Corps. And I don't want to misrepresent myself. I was a terrible communicator in the Marine Corps, which is why I think the Marine Corps and the agency both profited by me going this route as opposed to staying in the service. But I had friends who died there at the time I was going to school and such. And you also have the April bombing of the embassy, where several CIA officers would die, among the Americans that died and the Lebanese that died in that tragic bombing. And then 1984, we had hijackings begin. We had the kidnapping of the CIA station chief in Beirut, William Buckley. And that was a visceral, emotional circumstance for agency officers as I came into the picture in 84. 85, he would die. There were other hijackings. So I, for better or for worse, lived through interesting times, as Confucius say. And when you put the tail of the tape on it, I feel that maybe I get a ceremonial cane at the end of this presentation for my years of service. Post 9/11, and I think your audience will relate to it, there was both this sensation that, oh my goodness, we've been attacked, we've been hurt at home. There was shock and surprise, even though there probably shouldn't have been. I think the 9/11 Commission reports suggest that the CIA, among things it did wrong, also got things right, saying this was coming, something evil this way was coming, and there was an intention to strike the homeland. And it wasn't simply one presidential daily brief in August of 2001. There were a series of finished products based on the intelligence collected across the IC about, we believe something significant is coming. We don't know exactly where and when, but it's inevitable. The agency particularly felt it was facing an existential threat. The American public rightfully wanted accountability. How could this happen? Who's responsible? How did it go wrong? Who's going to be held to blame for it? And the agency believed, particularly being a secret organization operating in an open society, which didn't really have a lobby or advocates, companies or people that would lobby for it, was really at the end of its rope. At the time, there was genuine fear that Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense at the time, who was no fan of the agency prior to 9/11, and who would feel, and I think it's reflected in his own comments, personally embarrassed that the agency was able to put boots on the ground in Afghanistan within 15 days of 9/11. No fault of the soft community. There were issues such as legalities and authorities and such like that made him perhaps a threat, FBI obviously as well. So the agency leveraged what it felt it had, which was unique compared to the rest of the community, that it could leverage to at least secure the White House. I mean, if you have the president on your side, you're probably got the best defender you can. And that was covert action. The covert action authorities are unique for the agency, though technically the president can assign covert action to any USIC agency, but for various considerations, bureaucratic, political, We often want to choose the agency so that they're not we're putting our men and women in uniform at risk by making them do things that, contradict the Vienna and Geneva Conventions. The agency gets the nod. And that's what the agency did. But it was a perfect storm of concerns. The leadership at the time, George Tenet wanted to be a transitional figure going from a Democratic White House to a Republican White House. So he very much wanted to appease a Republican White House at that time. The leadership below him, the civilian senior CIA leaders, were taking on a new complexion. Some of the leadership was prior former military, very religious, very doctrinal, and actually liked a more hierarchical, more formal chemistry and culture that the agency didn't have. The agency was a spy service. I could have gone into the most senior officer's office to talk things, and it was always first name. There was a lot more engagement with the general workforce, a lot more outreach to junior officers, and a lot more informality to allow this speaking truth to power, to allow this objectivity. The agency is unique. It's not a policymaker. It was created in 1947 consciously to be a civilian organization. We didn't wear uniforms. A lot of intel services around the world, they have uniforms. They have ranks. They do have that hierarchy, which can stifle creativity and innovation because, rank consciousness and such like that. The agency didn't have that. And I think the fact that that was more introduced post 9/11 then set up a generational set of concerns where leaders were promoting other leaders who were like that, who also were then making their career based on find, fix, finish, paramilitary activities, kinetic activities, which certainly is a component of the agency. The agency was chartered to do foreign intelligence collection, analysis, all sorts of analysis, and also covert action. But covert action was designed to be a last resort. The CIA was designed to be even the collector of last resort. That's the language we speak of across the IC. Why, use the agency when you can get something for free or when there's low risk? You use the agency, which is a strategic collector for the most important things, the highest risk, the things that are hardest to get a hold of. So this set on a pattern over 20 years where officers who were then making key decisions about budget and focus were those who profited from this culture. And so I found myself towards the end of the career seeing an agency which, in a sports analogy, had lost a step when it came to foreign intelligence. Our adversaries were getting better. They were leveraging the new and innovative technology for counterintelligence, for defensive counterintelligence, for offensive counterintelligence. We see it in the cyber realm. We saw it in disinformation, denial and deception. And we saw it in cases that didn't end well as often and consistently as they should have for the CIA. So in that backdrop, when I left the agency, and I left the agency at a time where I was influenced by my sense that I wasn't able to contribute as much. The weaponization of intelligence had really gone on steroids. And it didn't start during the Trump administration. I think the Trump administration, in my opinion, carried it to a much worse degree where DNIs, the first DNI the Trump administration appointed, Dan Coats, a Republican, I had the greatest respect for. He saw his job as protecting the IC, not just the CIA, protecting the IC so it could speak truth to power, it could be inclusive, it could be integrated in its analysis. And he was pushed out for the likes of Richard Grenell and then John Ratcliffe, who were clearly there to be political operatives, which is not the mission of the DNI. The DNI should engender trust and secure the confidence of the American public that I, the DNI, am looking out to make sure they're being accountable, they're being lawful, they're doing the right things. When there's a mistake, we'll clean it up. That was increasingly lost. And I think a reflection of that culture that the agency had shifted to mitigated against our willingness to look at ourselves, to have accountability. And I think that really hurts you as an intelligence professional. I know the South community has the same view. We want to be the first ones to identify the weaknesses of our plan. We want to be the ones to throw the hardest questions, to see if it stands up to the test, because we want to get it right. We've got risks to take. We've got lives at stake. So we don't want to circle the wagons because we're protecting people. It's not about that. It's about the mission. And I felt that was being lost. And that really kind of sets the framework for my book, which I think in these days, as we're looking to pivoting to great strategic competition, gives the reader that sort of context of where we are and offers this as really a time of opportunity that we have the means, not just the agency, but the IC, the soft community, to make that shift, to make the right shift. But it's going to really come down to leadership, both above, but actually leadership as well individually, we as contributors to that mission.
Hey, thanks, Doug. You brought up some very important points. I think goes back, that both links directly to the purpose of the CIA, and I think also some of the culture of the CIA that I think is misunderstood and maybe shaded and framed because people, they watch James Bond's movies and then they have this kind of perception of intelligence. And I wanted to begin then, you mentioned that the CIA is the collector of last resort. And in my mind, I tie that to one of the human aspects of your book that I think was just excellent. And that's the relationship with an asset. I think many times we, because of Hollywood and stuff, we look at assets as disposable, right? But from my limited experience, there's no one who cherishes or values or wants to protect an asset's life more than a case officer. And this relationship is deep. And to me, I always thought to myself, I think back to FINCA, the acronym, and that's why that is important to be the collector of last resort, because of this value of human life and wanting to protect and not needlessly put it at risk. But in your book, you highlighted, if I understood right, there was a little bit of tension with that during when it became this more of a action-oriented aspect, where maybe some of that's forgotten. Was that an accurate read at times?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. First, for the benefit of those who are watching that may not know it, FINCA, from an intelligence perspective, is the CIA, the entire IC, well, I shouldn't say the entire IC, those who are conducting foreign intelligence, human operations, their threshold for collection is it foreign? Is it of interest to the community? Is it new? Is it clandestinely acquired? And is it authoritative? For DOD, they add the D at the end of FINCA for does it have a defense relation? And sorry, that's the professor in me these days. But what you're saying is absolutely right. And that's where so many of the fascinating complexities come into bear. A case officer is committed to his or her asset. A human service is committed. At the same time, the case officer and the human service can never fully trust their asset. You have to be skeptical. You have to test them constantly. You never fall in love with an agent. And I'm not suggesting the romantic fashion, and God knows, I think, and there's books about that, but that's not what it's about. It's about being true to the intelligence, being able to stand behind it, behind the source description for the consumer, how much the consumer can rely on this intelligence, what do we think of the source. So you're always re-recruiting and testing the source because life happens. People's circumstances change. They get caught, they lose their jobs, or the problem that created a precipitating crisis over which they accepted recruitment, volunteered, what have you, is over. Things are better right now. But with all of that, at the same time, you're committed to that obligation to the agent. You have to be their best friend, their father confessor, their priest, their mom, their rabbi. They have to believe that they are the center of your world, that there's nothing more important to you, the case officer. And we show that by action as well as words. We provide medical assistance for their families. We help them out of trouble. God forbid we relocate them or bring them to safety if they're ever threatened. So there's that really deep obligation. And it's interesting for your audience of military special operators, you're likewise putting people in harm's way, your own troops. And there's a reciprocal understanding and belief in that. It's not really the case in an agent world. We're putting our agent in harm's way, but they don't really have that same reciprocal, flag on their arm kind of, commitment to us, but yet we have to be true to them. I think as the agency, moved to a more paramilitary footing and had a more formal militaristic style, and not in the good sense, but in more a negative sense for a human service, we began to fall in love with tools. We began to focus on the tactical. In fact, I would contend that the counterterrorist strategy of the United States for 20 years was based on tactics, was based on kinetic tools, was based on an amazing refined ability to geolocate threats to us and then to remove them, be it by a capture or raid or kinetic. When you start falling in love with tools, it becomes the easy button, particularly when it gets that good. And there becomes an over-reliance of technology that feeds into those tools. And targeting folks, both in the military and the CIA and the IC writ large, liked things that were tangible to them. They liked SIGINT, they liked imagery, they liked forward motion video that puts somebody on the X, so to speak, but without remembering that they probably wouldn't have known where to look, how to look, what time of day, what was the pattern, and how to recognize your target from others based on human intelligence that might have provided selectors, routines, patterns of life. This created a sentiment that at least I saw in CIA, where decision makers who were further removed from the human clandestine world, they might have been case officers, but they grew up either in a paramilitary side or a CT counterterror-centric side where they weren't doing traditional tours. They weren't really having the same experience recruiting because, the war zone environment is different. A lot of our operations, sadly to say, our agents are brought to us. They volunteer or we use agents to bring them to, our platforms behind these big walls where case officers aren't really getting out on the street. They aren't really cultivating people. It's a different environment. So the whole process of, target analysis, spot, assess, develop, recruit is really different. It has a different flavor. And those are now the people that have a different view on assets and a different concern for how disposable they might be. And that's a real danger because the greatest tools in the world, and we'll always have great toys, are simply not going to work without human intelligence. And so it's not just me being romantic and longing for all this. I'm telling you from a practical point of view, one of the things I had to do in the final job I had at CIA, where I was CIA's chief of counterterrorism operations for, and the agency requires me to say South and Southwest Asia, but think about the countries that are in South and Southwest Asia. So you'll have a sense for what I was doing, but my job was to rebuild our agent inventory. We had so neglected it for a while, and the number of kinetic operations had been reduced, at least CIA's, because we had reduced our agent stable. And that was one of my missions to build that back up. So it's a practical fact, and it's an issue. And I think great power competition is going to, for CIA at least, force it back into that world of dynamics where you're not going to be able to use brute force. We always have contingency ops. We always want to avoid war by preparing for war, whether it's Russia or China, Iran, North Korea, wherever. But it's really about insight, understanding their plans, intentions, and capabilities, preempting things in the shadows, whether it's the CIA, whether it's the soft community, where we have deniability, where we do things either through people on the ground or people we have, or technical capabilities, which are enabled by agents in the right places, be it cyber or sabotage, across the full spectrum. That's going to force us to work in those shadows again, to focus more on stealth, to focus more on finesse, and to focus more on deniability, because we want to pick their pockets without them knowing anything's been stolen. Because if you steal something from your adversary and they know it, what do? They change it up. We don't want them to change it up. We want to know where their weaknesses are and leverage those without them ever knowing we were there.
You bring up many good points. And I think about, in my mind, I always think about intelligence for action, tactical action, to enable tactical action versus intelligence for understanding. And I think you're really getting at the difference and how maybe we've gone too much towards enabling action. You also raised some stuff about, I think of the broader approach about strategy and some issues with the way we approach that. And I want to circle back to that because I think to me that's the really important thing that your book gets at. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the influence of individuals. You're pretty critical of Brennan, and you said something in the book that I thought was very interesting, very thoughtful yet nuanced. You said Brennan made, and I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing if I mess this up, but Brennan changed the CIA from an espionage spy organization to an intelligence organization. So can you explain what you mean by that?
So John Brennan, who I sat across from in many a briefing, had a vision for the CIA, which I don't believe was consistent with its charter. The CIA was designed to be a central clearinghouse of intelligence from an analytic point of view, was supposed to be a strategic collector in terms of the foreign intelligence collection, and supposed to conduct our covert action, but with a very small footprint. John Brennan, who has been a CIA chief of station overseas, for those of the audience who don't know it, it was in the 90s, and it was a post where there was a lot more exchange, if you would, as opposed to as many unilateral operations. And so the CIA experimented a bit with having very senior, very substantive analysts in that part of the world, in those parts of the world, take a spin. We really haven't done it since, and you could choose your own interpretations of why. John Brennan, I think, and this is my personal opinion from having dealt with the man, felt he was sort of the outsider to the DO. He was never respected. And at the same point, he felt a real value for the CIA wasn't necessarily in recruiting and spying. And he said as much in a famous NPR interview. I know he denies it now, but he said, we don't steal secrets. He said, we exchange information. And that is what he said. And I've heard him say that. He saw the agency's role being more of policy, which diverges with the intent. In fact, there have been very few director of central intelligences or DCIAs today who are cabinet members, and that was conscious. Casey was one. I think Pompeo might have been one, and I could be stand corrected. But the reason for that is we weren't required to grade our own homework. If you're a policymaker, you're grading your own homework, and who's going to say their baby is ugly, right? It's harder to do. So Brennan saw himself as a statesman. He had been in the White House as the president's assistant for Homeland and Counterterrorism because politically he could not become DCIA at the time. There was a reserve to do that because he was part of enhanced interrogation and black sites and a proponent for it at the time. But then he came in after Mr. Panetta left, and I adored Mr. Panetta's time, by the way, and he was also your Secretary of Defense over there, and I thought he was a tremendous advocate, but he also had the ear of the president, which you wanted for your agency because he can lobby and argue your point and such. So John wanted to turn the agency more into a policy role, having a seat at the table, but also engaging with chiefs of states abroad. To a great degree, his great interaction in dealing with the chiefs of intelligence services, ministers of interior, and even heads of state would undermine his own chief of station, just as a Secretary of State could put his ambassadors at risk if the Secretary of State went, I'm going to do everything. I'm going to talk to everybody. I'm going to go to this meeting. I'm going to see this president. I'm going to see that head of state. And then what leverage does the ambassador have? Why deal with the ambassador? Why deal with the chief of station? Why deal with the military attache if they're not really the big players? So what he did, and very tangibly in some places, he shut down some operations that he was worried about the risk. He didn't want to have a compromise that would be politically embarrassing and undermine his policy role, both in a bilateral fashion with an overseas partner or at home in the White House. He took some things which were good, and I think he could have done better. I think his modernization intent in creating mission centers, which were largely fusion centers, which was already being done. The Counterterrorism Center was a mission center since it stood up in 1986. Our Counterproliferation Center was. It fused analysts, operators, detailees from across the IC, from DOD, from special forces, from state, ATF, whatever. Great concept. But because he was focused on policy, he started making the leaders of these centers analysts who were brilliant analysts, but not only were they never trained in operations, they had never conducted operations. They had, often just TDY'd abroad and didn't really live in foreign cultures and certainly didn't understand and appreciate the risk and the issues. They would have strong deputies from the ops world, but in a very political world, as we all understand, you're going to be pressured to do what your boss wants you to do, even if your boss doesn't necessarily make the right decision. That's what I hold him partially at fault for. We still have the consequences of modernization, which are the good ones of mission centers, but I've seen a lot less of analysts or technical folks running these mission centers. They may be deputies, they have a key role, they are part of the leadership team, and they get to weigh in because they're an important voice. And sometimes it's their lack of training, which makes them an important voice, because they may ask questions that we take for granted that, gosh darn, right? Good question. But they're not making the final call, which is a life or death call. I think that's a positive. I believe Mr. Brennan tried to reduce CIA's footprint in kinetic operations. To some extent, that was good. I don't think the CIA should be running kinetic operations because we're the easy button, because we may just have really good capabilities. We do it well. If you need it to be deniable, if you need it to be done in, let's say, a sovereign country, okay, yes, that's the CIA. But if DoD is also operating there and operating kinetic operations, why does CIA have to do it? Is it because we're getting some value added from an IC perspective out of it? Or it's because, oh, they have some great capabilities. They're a great complement. I like that he did that. I think in some cases he took it too far, because I think he took it in places where the CIA was the only option. And the agency probably would have better served US national security interests by still maintaining that role. But, you know, people talk about drones and ISR, right, intelligence drones and reconnaissance. The principal role, at least for most of the IC using those things, is intelligence. You know, at least CIA's ISR platforms spend, even when there's a covert action component that's kinetic, I'd say at least 99% of their time collecting intelligence, pulling the thread on networks once we identify somebody and trying to find their contacts and such like that. And sometimes as a combat enabler, and not always for ourselves, but for DoD, that makes sense, but that's not their principal mission. To that extent, I think philosophically he was right. I just don't necessarily think he did it with the right balance.
Hey, thanks, Doug. We have a question, a good question from the audience I wanted to pose to you, and I think it's tied to something you said earlier, where you said, you know, move to a more paramilitary style, but then that kind of juxtaposed in the positive stories that you tell about the CIA-DoD relationship in the book, and kind of some of the costs and the benefits of. So the question is, you know, the CIA and DoD have worked more closely than ever in the combat zones over the past 20 years and have built a very close working relationship. Given that recent history, how do you see the CIA and DoD working together in the future outside of the combat zones in great power competition?
That's a great question, and that's certainly in the future. SOF certainly has an important role outside the war zones as well, and I think we're talking now to some extent about authorities. And you know, DoD operates under Title 10, which is basically it can conduct war, self-defense on behalf of the country. CIA operates under Title 50, the National Security Act, where CIA is the ultimate manager for human operations abroad in terms of coordination, deconfliction. It's supposed to be the premier overseas human collector. So I feel good about where we are because of 20 years of cooperation, that there's less innate tension about who's in charge. When that's the first topic of conversation, and I know in some cases for setting lanes and stuff, it's important to understand all that, but there's been built this intimacy in the cross-pollination because there's been so much DoD detailee and assignee within the CIA and vice versa. And we, you know, our paramilitary teams had SOF operators in it, integrated into it. And likewise, we were there supporting a lot of the SOF elements on their mission. So I think, you know, the first hurdle we because these 20 years will help us. I think for CIA, the trick is going to be how we best complement one another with the SOF community in terms of mission. For the CIA, it's easy in a sense for us. Our mission is going to really return to strategic intelligence collection. When we're looking at Russia, North Korea, Iran, China, the principles, we're looking at stealing their secrets, strategic secrets, the most important ones, less of a focus on tactical. SOF elements for the DoD, as my interaction with them might give me some insight, but not complete, is going to be they are preparing for contingencies. They're preparing for supporting military operations which depend on intelligence, on preparing the battlefield, preparing the environment. So there's a very happy collaboration point there. I think some of it's going to be really understanding what are our missions, not like, oh, where are the lines in the sand between who's in charge. SOF is going to need to collect intelligence to enable it to have operations on the shelf if we go to war with these strategic competitors, and to have advantages, with measures short of war, which sometimes will be in the cyber field, disinformation field, covert influence field. I mean, there's a number of them, and there's room for that. So I think the challenge will be less that, do we trust one another? Because especially those of us who work with one another, of course we do. We've risked our lives to one another. But do we understand what we're there? Can we make sure there's no sense of, oh, CIA is threatened by SOF, or SOF is threatened by CIA, and get back to, this is appropriate for you. This is what you should be doing. We mutually have to reinforce how we do it. CIA will be the expert for collecting foreign intelligence that SOF needs to enable those contingencies, but is not going to be saying, oh, you shouldn't do this. It will basically offer help to how to do it right, so how everybody succeeds.
No, I think that's important. To me, it's, you can't just understand the capabilities or know the capabilities of the other, but, appreciate the purpose, and the role of our partners. And, many times, we want to be good partners, but we each have our own different purposes and focus, and not lose sight of that. One of the things you hit on the book, you mentioned this, it's about the cultural aspect, and, in my view, after 20 years in growing generations of individuals who have perceived the mission in one way, which, as you point out in your book, has gone to kind of a tactical focus, does that change the nature, the culture, the character of the organization? And if so, do you have any concerns moving forward about that in the CIA? And any advice on how you kind of shift from that to ensure that, learn from the last 20 years, but maybe redirect some of the cost of the last 20 years to change focus, I should say?
So we can go back to, we talked about Hopscotch and Walter Matthau. For anybody who's ever seen Walter Matthau or Peter Falk, who played CI people, God bless them both. They're kind of schlubby guys. They're not handsome. They trip over their own feet sometimes, as I do on stairs, but they're sneaky. They're mischievous. They're cunning, and they're stealthy. And sometimes you just don't notice them, and that's the whole point. And they pick your pocket, and you never know it's been picked. So the image of the agency officer over the last 20 years, because of this change in the culture, so many of my colleagues and friends, and I spent plenty of time in those places. I mean, all you see are pictures of them, with their shemagh on and their M4 and their rack on their chest and stuff like that. And I'm being mean, I suppose. I don't have any of those pictures. I mean, I always thought the idea for a spy was, if you got to pull out your semi-automatic rifle and the grenades in your teeth, you may have done something wrong, because you're supposed to be sneaky, right? Nobody should know it. Now, when I carried a weapon, and I did in locations beyond the war zone as well, it was to get off the X. It was to get out of harm's way, and it was the last resort. Because once I'm shooting at anybody, and nobody wants me to be shooting at anybody, Lord knows, probably the jig is up, right? There's no concealment. I'm about concealing, hiding, never being seen. I'm not a soldier. I'm sneaky. I like being sneaky. I'm a spy. But there's so much of that, and there's so many of my colleagues and senior officers who grew up in that culture that's kind of like, they talk about themselves as, oh, I'm a real badass. I don't really think I am. Luckily my wife is pretty strong too. So if we ever got into a dicey situation, she's going to be able to pitch it. And jokes aside, yeah, I can take care of myself, but that's not how I see myself. I see myself as a spy. And if they see themselves as warrior, that's to the detriment of espionage. So as we now look to strategic competition and getting back to shadows and trench coats and all that kind of stuff, we need to be very secure about who we are and what we are, and also think it's pretty damn cool. I think it's really cool to be Walter Matthau. I think it's super cool to be Peter Falk and not necessarily Daniel Craig, which I can never pull off. I think James Bond movies are really super, but have you ever seen him do a travel accounting? Has he ever had trouble with finance? You're not entitled to rent that car. You only had a subcompact. I mean, That's the reality, and that's fine. It's government bureaucracy. But we need to be secure about who we are, because if you're not secure, you're not going to be critical. You're not going to really be scrupulous and scrutinize, is this the right thing to do? And is it my idea that's making it the right thing to do? Or is it, on closer examination, right? So we need to be able to be introspective and be demanding on ourselves, be our worst critic, be exhaustive in detail. That's what's going to be necessary, because the trick about strategic power competition is we spent 20 years investing the CIA as a counterterrorist paramilitary agency, and a lot of SOF did as well. Now it's a different tradecraft landscape out there, isn't it? We read about, services wrapping up intelligence agencies. We read about biometrics, cyber technology, facial recognition, tracking. Spying is more challenging now with all of that. But a good spy thinks, whatever is thrown at me, I can leverage that as well. Again, I'll make lemonade out of that. I'll manipulate it. But we need investment in that. I don't know that the agency invested as much in that as our competitors and our rivals and our adversaries have over 20 years. I think we're still better than that. I know we're still better than that. But I really wish we'd been spending more time on tradecraft. And I also worry that the culture of that's maybe bred more conformity, not bucking the system, not challenging the system, is going to mean those who are responsible for making innovation and tradecraft, making us better, are going to be afraid to take greater risks. They're going to be under such pressure to move the needle, to show some success, to justify what they're doing. Are they going to take a look at our tradecraft abilities or technology from a very modular point of view? And when I say modular, meaning instead of going back to the drawing board and tearing things down, let's just maybe take what we think works best, which is based on a lot of key assumptions of what's working best, and then maybe tinkering a little bit here, a little bit there. I would say what is called for now is what was called for in the 80s. And one of my heroes, and those of you who've read about him know Burton Gerber. I teach a class at Georgetown, which was his class. I'm giving him a spell this semester. He was an amazing innovator. He had technology challenges as well. He had spy dust, he had tracking dogs. He also had the onset of cameras behind the Iron Curtain. He was our chief of station in Moscow in the early 80s. He was the chief of our Soviet Eurasia division. He came up with things that people thought, you're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. The idea of meeting a sensitive Russian agent in Moscow. One of our most important agents was Tokachev, the $1 billion spy. For those of you who read the book, if you haven't, you really should. After you buy my book first, and then read $1 Billion Spy. He thought, let's meet Tokachev. We met Tokachev like 24 times. Can you imagine that? It was all dead drops there, right? Or maybe brush passes, which he also helped innovate. We need that spirit of innovation. We need that willingness to take some risks, to be an aggressive spy service that takes well-considered, not reckless risk. And that we know we've got leadership that's gonna, have our backs, that's gonna cover us. Because it's okay if you make mistakes. I mean, it's not okay because we have lives at risk, but if you're making mistakes because you've really thought about it, well-considered risk, you're taking some chances, that's what a spy service does. If the risk you're worried about are political, if that's your calculus, and your hubris are creating mistakes and errors because you don't want to hear different opinions, you don't want to try something new, you want to take a risk, those are where the accountability should come in. So, I know we've got the right people in the IC, CIA, and the SOC community, some of the most brilliant, talented, hard-charging, aggressive, risk-taking people. They'll need leaders to back them up, and they'll need a willingness to go ahead and go, this is a well-considered risk. Let's be out there. That's what I get paid to do. I get paid to take the right kinds of risks. If we apply that, we'll come out on top.
Thanks, Doug. I think you and I need to get together and write a TV show about the realities of government service, based on your travel voucher. So we could have, a 30-minute series about filing paperwork and all the entertaining with that. But I always found it interesting your comment on Bond versus Walter Matthau. And again, exceptional movie. And what kept coming to mind watching it is, if you're a clandestine organization, do you want Walter Matthau out there as the gray man, or do you want, Daniel Craig out there drinking martinis? And again, this was my favorite Walter Matthau. It actually beat out Bad News Bears. So I mean, it's a very, very good show. But you raised the in my mind when you were highlighting, how the agency is adaptive, and we've been, the agency has been faced with challenges in the past, and they've overcome them. I think sometimes we forget that, while technology creates risk or limitation, it also creates opportunities. And so sometimes it's a washout between the two. And so, I think that's an important thing for us to consider. And at the end of the day, it's about creativity, and it's about thinking new ways to face these problems. Also wanted to, in your book, see if you had any comments on it. I thought, you highlighted the importance of disinformation moving forward, and something that, I mean, if you look at the Cold War, the agency, for anyone who's ever seen Animal Farm as a kid, that was a disinformation operation by, by the agency. Do you ever fear that this kind of, warrior mentality that you highlighted, and the sexiness, the bondish, a person with a gun, detracts from the individuals who might be drawn to the agency, who would love to do the, be the Walter Matthau or the disinformation type of focus individual?
So I'm going to take that in two components, because I want to talk about covert influence and psychological operations. So one of the advantages DoD has is they still have a lot of investment and a lot of smart people doing PSYOPs. I mean, that's what it's called, right? PSYOPs. It's not covert influence in terminology, but it really is, practically speaking. So since the military isn't allowed to do covert action, deniable covert action, it prefaces its psychops and disinformation ops, if you would, as protection, self-defense, protecting your forces, preparation of the battlefield. So it's not a lost art for you all, and you have great resources. For the CIA, it's one of those lost arts of American intelligence. It was lost after the Cold War, and sadly so. I think the role of it was even more critical for counterterrorism because, and I think the 9/11 report does it justice, what we needed to fight were not just the terrorists who are already terrorists, was fighting the conditions from which terrorism came and more terrorists would be recruited. What were the views, the thoughts, that sense of victimization that terrorist organizations abroad and domestic terrorist organizations at home manipulate to go, this is an existential threat to you, you've got to rise up, you must be willing to detach yourself from killing because this is how you're protecting yourself because they're coming for you. So the CIA didn't invest in that quite as much. They had it, but one, there wasn't a great investment. Two, it didn't attract the best and brightest, which will be my segue to your second point. Because what was getting attention were the metrics of combatants killed, videotapes, pred porn is what we would call it, of amazing strikes, placing hellfires in a window, whatever it is, or the R9X, which comes down with blades, all these different things. And I'm only speaking to non-classified things here. But imagine how sexy these videos are when you show them to oversight, or the people who pay your salary, provide you budget, and to the president, who ultimately makes the strategic decisions for the country. What are we going to focus on? But it took us away from a number of things. It took us away from tradecraft, as I spoke to earlier, because we were so focused on tools and tactics. And it took us away from covert influence. During the Cold War, the CIA was freaking cool at covert influence. I mean, some things I can't speak to, but I could tell you that there were weapon systems that were lethal against us, that the people who had them lost confidence in them because of covert influence. Can you imagine that? There were points of view of countries about whether to accept US bases, US weapon systems, intermediate missiles, that the opinion was swayed by covert influence. Part of the downfall of the Soviet Empire wasn't just this arms race that the Soviets lost they couldn't afford. There was a lot of covert influence. For historians, and I sadly say to historians because I was an adult, think of Poland in the 80s. To the extent I could speak, I would say there was some covert influence going on there. And how did it end up? Amazing tools, but if you're not attracting the best and brightest to it, you're not going to have the best results. So it's not just budget. In terms of who's attracted to the agency these days, and will people be disappointed because they still want to be James Bond? I'm not worried about that because I really don't want James Bond. I need a few. I need a limited number of people to be the warriors, to be the paramilitary operations officers who largely come from your community, and Marines as well, so a shout out for the Corps, who then have a very specified role for a very important reason, but don't then change the culture of the organization. If we're going to be about spying, stealing secrets, being in the shadows, in the alleys at night, if we want people, and I know those of you in the SOF community have heard this, who are great at adapting to dynamic circumstances, fluid issues, ambiguity, not having the whole picture, those are the people I want coming to the CIA, who don't want to be the center of attention, who don't want pictures in their office of them with their M4s and whatever they were doing. That's what I want. So I'm not worried about that. And they're coming, by God. I think the agency needs to do a better job on who it brings in terms of diversity. I think the agency, if you give me a chance to talk about it, has focused too much over the years, even when we're taking people of different ethnic backgrounds and colors and religions, they all pretty much have a very suburban, and I dare say in some cases entitled. They've never had anybody tell them no. They've never been in a sports thing and never won at least a trophy. I want people who could deal with adversity. I want people who could handle the streets. I want people who may have had some blips in their lives, nothing that will compromise our ability to trust them, but have proven themselves by growing up in a rough area, by putting themselves through college or going to community college, by not being, John Smith the seventh, because their dad and their grandma, whatever, went to the best schools in the world, but they know how to handle themselves. They know how to deal with threats and adversity. They know how to deal with tough times when there are dynamic circumstances. And I think that needs an outreach, not just looking for people of those ethnic persuasions or different gender reflections in Stanford and Berkeley and Harvard and University of Michigan. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to insult anybody's school, all great schools, but who went to CCNY in New York, right? Or the Community College of Iowa or whatever like that. Those are people who make good spies. The truth when I talk about it in my book, of all the recruitments that the CIA makes, the Director of Operations makes, 80% of those recruitments are done by 20% of the case officers. Because we can teach a lot of tools, but you can't teach some of these real ingrained abilities to think on your feet, to relate to people from everywhere. And the gifts, the talents, the languages, the culture, the perspectives people from this wider, diverse prison bring, it's obvious that's great for a foreign intelligence service, because how many people from Westchester, Pennsylvania are we recruiting overseas? We're recruiting people from, the bad neighborhoods of Baghdad, right? From, Hong Kong, from, Uganda. So while I'm confident I can operate most anywhere, for me, I've got challenges where I stand out as an old white dude. So people who can work in those societies, understand it, bring gifts, and bring also a different outlook are going to make us better.
Thanks. When you mentioned Poland, and I hope I don't get the author wrong because it's an excellent book, but I believe it's Seth Jones has a book that came out about 3 years ago that talks about some of the U.S. operations in support of in Poland during that time frame, which is a great book. Want to kind of, we have a few minutes left. And one of the things I think that's the most important issue, and you raised it in different ways during our discussion, but it's really about, strategy, and how we kind of navigate the world, the United States does. And really the aspect of it, that is, from the perspective that, we maybe too often we don't understand, but we take action. So we think that, by doing something, we're making a difference, but often we don't. And I kind of tie that back to, the what you point in the book and you mentioned here about the whole counterterrorism, where, we can count drone strikes, we can count dead terrorists, but at the end of the day, if you really pull back the onion, are we in any better condition than we are strategically as before? And so I was hoping you could comment about that, how we kind of just approach the world, the United States. And then also, you mentioned the influence of policymakers. You know, during my own research, I interviewed a member of the Obama's Presidential Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and he made a good point. And he said, you know, I went over to visit an organization, and what they decided to show me was a drone strike. He said, I'm supposed to be focused on the strategic, and they're showing me a tactical action. He said, but at the end of the day, it's our policymakers, because organizations are going to deliver what the policymakers want to see. And this obsession by the policymakers on drone strikes, on things you can quantify, or back to your point, loving to talk to the operator in the room, you know, pushes organizations to go that direction. So if, you know, spend a few minutes talking about your observations of those things.
So I think Afghanistan is a great case in point, and I know a lot of your audience has been invested in that over the years, personally, tangibly, blood and treasure. And some of my soft colleagues have said, from their perspective, you know, the problem, I did however many deployments there, and we were fighting, you know, a 1-year war 20 different times. And that was a component of legacy and people turnover, but it was really a reflection of strategy. The United States is big, the government's big, it's bureaucratic. So it's easier to change tactics, and tactics were good, and tactics evolved, and tactics got better and better, but we didn't change our strategy, we didn't learn. Taliban did. If you look at their success, they learned from their history. They went after the border crossings. They went after the North, where the Northern Alliance had hurt them in 2001. They went after lines of communication that would support an insurgency, that would support cross-border survival and connection and a fight. They adapted, but you know, you're talking about a leadership of what, a couple of dozen who sit on the shore, as opposed to moving the dial in the United States. But a lot of it is risk. We took a strategy in Afghanistan and we kept doing the same thing for 20 years, and it wasn't working in terms of a strategic point of view. Great, you know, successes on the battlefield, lots of metrics, lots of dead terrorists, but look what happened when we left. So the problem is just that. It's needing leadership, and it does start with policymakers to encourage, you know, a critical view of strategy and not to lose sight of strategy. What are we trying to accomplish? What at the end of the day is our core strategic mission? And how often we actually do get lost, and it's mission creep or slope or slide. We went to Afghanistan to preempt Al-Qaeda from following up on the 9/11 attacks, and that's what it was. Yes, justice, revenge, and certainly the passion there, but that's what the mission was, and we succeeded that mission pretty quickly, and then positioned ourselves to continue to attrit and suppress. But strategically, we started getting into a whole different world. And you could argue, I could argue all sides of this question, but if we really did want to stabilize Afghanistan, if we wanted to have a political commitment, then if we saw it wasn't working over 20 years, could we have thought of, you know, maybe applying an American government model, a centralized, you know, chief of state, centralized power, and an integrated army in a country that is very tribally aligned, where, you know, sort of like take the Civil War, where Union and Confederate elements were organized by where they came from, you know, the 21st Maine or the Army of Northern Virginia, because they fought together, they understand each other. That was probably a better fit for Afghanistan, and that's where their loyalties lied, but never once did we ever think of it. And why? Our baby's not ugly. This was our idea. How can we say it's wrong? So people aren't going to change their recommendations up until the leaders say, you know, I don't think it's working. But if you start putting a rosy spin, oh, look at the number of, look at the metrics, you know, look at the, you know, the combatants killed or captured, look at the percentage of population under government control, you are preventing yourself from making those key strategic changes.
Now, and I think you highlight the importance of us being reflective, like you were in the book, and thinking back over the last 20 years, you know, and talking about the goodness and the success, like in the CIA-DoD relationship and improving, but really ask the question with a jaundiced eye. I mean, for all those tactical successes, strategically, let's be honest, we have failed. And I think we really need to grapple with that as professionals. Unfortunately, I could speak with you all afternoon. I think this is fascinating, but we've run out of time. I would like to the audience to highly recommend your book, especially for the soft practitioner. I think it provides insight into an organization, a partner organization that we work with closely. And then also, shows that there's value in criticizing your own organization and learning from it with a focus on improving it. So thank you. Give you, an opportunity to give your last words before we depart.
Dave, thanks so much. Thanks to the audience. I'm so proud of having any affiliation with the SOF community, of being included by SOCOM and included by JSOU, which does a great job, which is committed to education. So thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for everybody's service. Do buy the book. I think it's a good one. I think it's going to be unexpected when you read it in a lot of ways, that you'll find things you didn't expect to find. So thank you for the privilege.
Yeah. Hey, thank you, Doug. And this has been very enjoyable on my end.